What if I were the devil? This isn't a question of theatrics or fantasy, but a thought experiment. Imagine I had one overarching goal: to keep people as far from God as possible, all without them realizing it. How would I do it? The answer isn't in the obvious horrors or grand displays of evil. No, the most effective plan would be far more subtle: a whisper instead of a shout, a shadow instead of a spotlight. If I were the devil, my greatest tool wouldn't be outright rebellion, but quiet distraction. My strategy wouldn't be to convince people to hate God, but to forget Him altogether. I would carefully craft a world where the pursuit of trivialities, the noise of endless distractions, and the worship of self would drown out any desire to seek the divine. And all the while, they would feel as though they were thriving. The beauty of subtlety is its invisibility. People rarely question what feels normal, even if it leads them astray. If I were the devil, I wouldn't storm the gates of their minds with fear and fire. Instead, I'd lull them into complacency with comfort, busyness, and the illusion of control. They would never suspect the gentle erosion of their spiritual foundations because it would feel as though everything was as it should be. This thought experiment isn't just a creative exercise, it's a call to awareness. To understand the nature of distractions, divisions, and subtle manipulations in our lives is to arm ourselves against them. What if the barriers keeping us from a deeper connection to God aren't external, but internal? What if the loudest voice keeping us from faith is the one whispering, "Tomorrow is soon enough to seek truth"? This book isn't about fear-mongering or blaming external forces. It's about shining a light on the unseen, on the ways we may unknowingly keep ourselves from God. The devil's blueprint thrives on ignorance and inaction. By exploring this concept, we can take the first step toward recognizing and dismantling the barriers between us and the divine. As you read on, consider this an invitation to see the world differently. Each chapter will peel back the layers of distraction, confusion, and false fulfillment to reveal the subtle yet powerful forces shaping our spiritual journeys. And remember, the most dangerous lies are the ones that feel closest to the truth. Welcome to If I Was the Devil. Crafted by Mindful Literary, this book is a mirror, a guide, and a challenge. Let's explore the blueprint and how to rise above it. The art of subtlety. If I were the devil, I wouldn't come crashing through the door with a pitchfork in flames. That's too obvious, too crude. Fear might work momentarily, but it rarely lasts. Instead, my strategy would hinge on subtlety, quiet, undetectable influences that weave themselves seamlessly into the fabric of everyday life. Distraction, misdirection, and division would be my tools, all designed to appear so natural that no one would think twice about them. Imagine a world where people are too busy to ask deeper questions. I would fill their days with endless tasks, notifications, and obligations. Their schedules would be so packed that the thought of setting aside time for prayer, reflection, or connection with God would seem like a luxury they couldn't afford. And here's the genius of subtlety. These distractions wouldn't feel malicious. They'd feel productive, even necessary. Work deadlines, social engagements, and a never-ending stream of entertainment. None of these seem harmful, yet together they form a barrier, keeping people from ever looking up and asking, "What truly matters?" Misdirection would be my next weapon. I wouldn't tell people outright lies. Instead, I'd twist the truth just enough to make it ineffective. I'd shift their focus to the superficial aspects of faith, rules, rituals, and appearances, while steering them away from its heart. They'd think they were on the right path, while slowly veering off course. The best lies, after all, are the ones wrapped in half-truths. And then there's division. If I were the devil, I wouldn't need to destroy communities. I'd only need to sow enough seeds of misunderstanding to keep them fractured. Differences of opinion would become insurmountable rifts. I'd amplify disagreements over interpretations of scripture, political ideologies, or cultural values, turning people against one another. And I'd do it in such a way that they'd believe they were defending righteousness. Division would thrive, not because people wanted to hate one another, but because they genuinely believed they were in the right. Subtlety lies in its ability to blend into the background. Distraction looks like busyness. Misdirection feels like truth. Division feels like conviction. None of these tactics scream danger, but they work together to quietly steer people away from God's presence, leaving them isolated, confused, and spiritually stagnant. This is the art of subtlety, to create a world where people don't realize they're drifting away because the current feels so comfortable. The beauty of this strategy is that it doesn't demand rebellion, it merely invites complacency. The quieter the deception, the more effective it becomes. The question we must ask ourselves is simple yet profound. How much of our daily lives is shaped by these subtle forces, and how often do we stop to notice them? Recognizing the art of subtlety is the first step in reclaiming our attention, our purpose, and our connection to God. Why this matters. Understanding the traps and illusions. Why should we care about subtle distractions and illusions? Because their greatest danger lies in their invisibility. When people are kept spiritually stagnant, they're not necessarily running away from God. They're simply standing still, unaware of the slow drift pulling them further from His presence. If I were the devil, this would be my masterpiece. Not to make people hate God, but to make them indifferent, complacent, or completely unaware of His existence. Think about it. A visible enemy is easy to confront, but an unseen force? That's a far more formidable challenge. When people can't identify what's holding them back, they're less likely to question it. The traps I would set would look and feel like life as usual: busy schedules, comfortable routines, and a sense of good enough. These are the subtle snares that prevent people from seeking more, growing deeper, and truly understanding their spiritual purpose. Comfort is one of the most insidious traps. If people feel satisfied with their material lives, they're less likely to search for spiritual fulfillment. They'd mistake physical ease for inner peace, all while their souls grow restless beneath the surface. Why challenge the status quo if everything seems fine? This illusion of satisfaction keeps people from questioning what they might be missing. Another powerful illusion is the false sense of progress. People might think they're moving forward because they're checking boxes, career advancements, social milestones, even religious rituals. But spiritual growth isn't measured by external achievements. If I were the devil, I'd make sure people confuse busyness with purpose, ensuring they never pause long enough to ask whether they're truly aligned with their higher calling. Comparison is a perfect tool for creating spiritual stagnation. If people spend their energy comparing their lives to others, envying their success, criticizing their flaws, or trying to outperform them, they'll lose sight of their unique path. They'll be too preoccupied with external validation to focus on their inner journey. I'd ensure that they equate their worth with how they measure up to others, rather than seeing themselves through God's eyes. Spiritual stagnation doesn't happen in a single moment. It's a gradual process, a series of small compromises, overlooked truths, and misplaced priorities. And it matters because every moment spent in stagnation is a moment of potential lost. A life disconnected from God is a life disconnected from its ultimate purpose. The traps and illusions I'd employ wouldn't feel like traps at all. They'd feel like life as usual, like pursuing success, happiness, or fulfillment on one's own terms. But that's the danger. When people believe they're in control, they're less likely to surrender to something greater. The goal wouldn't be to make people reject God outright, but to create a world where they never feel the need to seek Him in the first place. Understanding these traps is the first step in breaking free from them. Awareness shatters illusions. By recognizing the ways we are distracted, misled, and divided, we can begin to reclaim our spiritual lives and move toward a deeper connection with God. This matters because the stakes couldn't be higher. The difference between a life lived in truth and one lived in illusion is the difference between fulfillment and emptiness, growth and stagnation, light and shadow. Chapter 1. Busy but not fulfilled. If I were the devil, my first tactic would be to keep people busy. Not productive, not purposeful, but endlessly preoccupied with tasks and distractions that leave them no time to pause, reflect, or connect with anything greater than their to-do lists. The beauty of busyness is that it masquerades as virtue. In a world that celebrates hustle and hard work, being busy feels like an accomplishment. But beneath the surface, it's often just a clever distraction from the things that truly matter. Busyness has become a badge of honor. Ask someone how they're doing, and the answer is often, "I'm so busy." It's said with a mix of pride and exhaustion, as if being overwhelmed is proof of one's value. In reality, it's often a sign of misaligned priorities. People fill their days with meetings, errands, and endless scrolling on their phones, leaving little room for introspection or spiritual growth. If I were the devil, I'd design a culture where busyness is mistaken for purpose. I'd make people believe that their worth is tied to how much they do, not who they are or what they stand for. I'd fill their days with noise, notifications, deadlines, and distractions, so that the quiet moments where they might hear the whisper of God are drowned out entirely. Busyness creates the illusion of progress, but it often leads to emptiness. People wake up, rush through their day, and fall into bed exhausted, only to repeat the cycle the next morning. They're moving, but are they really going anywhere? This relentless pace leaves little room for reflection or spiritual connection. The moments that might be spent in prayer, meditation, or simply sitting in silence are swallowed up by the next urgent task. Even rest becomes another item to check off the list. Vacations are planned down to the minute, and even relaxation feels performative, something to document on social media for approval. This isn't just about a lack of time, it's about a lack of presence. When the mind is constantly racing, it's almost impossible to tune into the deeper truths of life. The culture of busyness doesn't just steal time, it steals attention, the very thing needed to nurture a relationship with God. One of the cruelest tricks of busyness is its ability to mimic purpose. People equate being busy with being successful, productive, or even fulfilled. But productivity without meaning is a hollow pursuit. It's possible to be incredibly busy and yet achieve nothing of real value. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that people confuse motion with progress. I'd make them feel guilty for resting, suspicious of silence, and uncomfortable with stillness. I'd make sure they never stop long enough to ask, why am I doing all of this? What is it for? To break free from the trap of busyness, people must first recognize it for what it is, a distraction. This doesn't mean abandoning responsibilities or ambition, but it does mean reassessing priorities. Time is finite, and how it's spent reflects what truly matters. Imagine reclaiming just a few moments each day to pause and breathe, to step away from the chaos and reflect on life's bigger questions. Imagine making space for God, not as another item on the to-do list, but as the foundation for everything else. The antidote to busyness isn't laziness, it's intentionality. It's choosing to live with purpose rather than rushing through life on autopilot. In the battle for the soul, busyness is one of the devil's sharpest tools. It's subtle, seductive, and devastatingly effective. But awareness is the first step toward freedom. By slowing down and making room for reflection, people can begin to see past the distractions and reconnect with what truly matters. The allure of instant gratification. If I were the devil, my next move would be to offer the world everything it could want, instantly. I'd make life a buffet of immediate pleasures, where anything from entertainment to comfort could be accessed with the swipe of a finger or the push of a button. Why work for fulfillment when you can have temporary satisfaction in seconds? Pleasure and convenience would become the new idols, replacing the slower, deeper journey of spiritual growth with the shiny appeal of instant gratification. Humans are wired to seek pleasure. It's an innate part of survival. But in the modern world, I'd exploit that wiring by oversupplying pleasure. I'd fill every corner of life with quick hits of dopamine, social media likes, junk food, online shopping, binge-worthy content. All of these offer fleeting joy, but none provide lasting satisfaction. Here's the brilliance of it. The more people consume these instant pleasures, the emptier they feel. And in that emptiness, they seek more. It's a never-ending cycle, a treadmill of temporary highs that leave the soul parched. Spiritual growth, which often requires patience, discipline, and struggle, would feel unappealing next to the immediacy of modern comforts. If I were the devil, I'd also make convenience king. Why face challenges when there's an easier way? I'd design a world where people could avoid discomfort entirely. Food delivered to their doorsteps, entertainment streaming without pause, answers available instantly through a search engine. Struggle would seem unnecessary, and with it, the spiritual lessons that come from perseverance and patience would be lost. Convenience might seem harmless. After all, who doesn't want life to be easier? But here's the trap. Convenience dulls the muscles of resilience. When everything comes effortlessly, people lose their ability to wait, to endure, to trust in something greater than themselves. The very virtues that build a strong relationship with God, faith, patience, and perseverance, are eroded in a life lived for convenience. The most devastating effect of instant gratification is how it shrinks the horizon of human vision. People become so focused on what they want right now that they lose sight of their long-term purpose. They trade deep fulfillment for shallow pleasures, mistaking momentary happiness for true joy. If I were the devil, I'd make sure they never realized the cost. They wouldn't notice how their pursuit of quick fixes steals their time, drains their energy, and leaves them feeling hollow. They wouldn't see how it pulls them further from God, who calls them to something far greater than fleeting satisfaction. Not all instant gratifications are obvious sins. In fact, many appear harmless, even beneficial. A quick scroll through uplifting social media content or an impulse purchase of a self-help book might feel productive. But even these good pleasures can become traps when they replace deeper engagement. If I were the devil, I'd encourage people to dabble in spirituality just enough to feel good, but not enough to truly change. I'd let them skim the surface, satisfying the itch for inspiration without ever diving deep into transformation. The antidote to instant gratification isn't denial, it's delay. The ability to wait, to trust the process, and to endure discomfort is a form of spiritual strength. It's in these moments of waiting that growth happens, where deeper truths reveal themselves. Imagine resisting the pull of the quick fix and choosing instead the slower, more rewarding path. Instead of binging on shallow pleasures, people could seek experiences that nourish the soul. Meaningful conversations, acts of service, moments of silence with God. These take time, but their rewards are immeasurable. Instant gratification may promise everything, but it delivers little. By understanding its allure and choosing to rise above it, people can break free from its cycle and step into a life of true fulfillment. The question is simple yet profound. Are we chasing what feels good, or are we pursuing what is good? Chapter 2. The Digital Deluge. If I were the devil, I'd place the world in a constant state of distraction by flooding it with technology. Not because technology itself is inherently evil, but because it has the power to overwhelm minds and hearts when left unchecked. I wouldn't need to destroy people's faith. I'd only need to drown it in a sea of notifications, endless scrolling, and constant noise. Technology is everywhere, seamlessly woven into the fabric of modern life. It connects us, entertains us, and even helps us solve problems. But its omnipresence comes at a cost. If I were the devil, I'd make sure people couldn't escape its grip, tethering them to their devices from the moment they wake up to the second they fall asleep. I'd design apps and platforms to be addictive, offering just enough stimulation to keep people coming back for more. Social media, with its likes, comments, and endless feed, would be my masterpiece, a carefully engineered trap that feeds on their attention while offering nothing of substance in return. People wouldn't even notice how much time they were losing because every moment spent online would feel productive or enjoyable. Technology promises connection, but if I were the devil, I'd use it to create disconnection instead. Virtual interactions would replace face-to-face conversations, leaving people feeling isolated despite their many friends and followers. Deep, meaningful relationships would erode, replaced by surface-level exchanges and curated online personas. I'd make people so dependent on their screens that silence and solitude would feel unbearable. They'd reach for their phones in every idle moment, unable to sit with their thoughts or listen for God's still, small voice. Technology would become their constant companion, crowding out the space where spiritual reflection might have taken root. One of the greatest tools in the digital deluge is the sheer volume of information. People have access to more knowledge than ever before, but if I were the devil, I'd ensure they were overwhelmed rather than enlightened. I'd flood their feeds with breaking news, controversial opinions, and endless entertainment, leaving them too scattered to focus on what truly matters. Information without discernment is chaos. People would feel informed but confused, knowledgeable but powerless. They'd consume content endlessly but never find clarity or peace. Spiritual truths would be drowned out by the noise, buried under the weight of trivialities and distractions. Technology also offers the illusion of control. With a device in hand, people can access any information, connect with anyone, and accomplish almost anything. But if I were the devil, I'd use this illusion to keep them from seeking real control, the kind that comes from surrendering to God's will. I'd make them believe they could manage their lives perfectly through apps, calendars, and tools, leaving no room for faith or trust in a higher power. Their dependence on technology would replace their dependence on God. The digital deluge doesn't have to be a prison. Technology can be a tool for good when used intentionally, but it requires vigilance and boundaries. People must learn to reclaim their attention, setting limits on screen time and prioritizing moments of stillness and presence. Imagine a life where technology serves rather than enslaves, a life where notifications don't dictate your day and screens don't consume your time. This is the first step toward breaking free from the digital deluge, creating space for reflection, connection, and spiritual growth. The question we must ask ourselves is this: are we using technology, or is it using us? By understanding its role in overwhelming our minds and hearts, we can take back control and refocus on what truly matters. After all, no app or platform can replace the peace and purpose that come from a life centered on God. How constant connectivity creates disconnection from higher truths. If I were the devil, I'd turn humanity's greatest gift, its ability to connect, into its greatest hindrance. I'd create a world where constant connectivity feels like progress, where every moment is filled with a stream of messages, updates, and alerts. And yet, in all that noise, I'd ensure that people become profoundly disconnected, not just from each other, but from themselves and, most importantly, from higher truths. The promise of constant connectivity is enticing. The idea that we can stay in touch with anyone anywhere at any time. But beneath this promise lies a subtle trap. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that these connections remain superficial. People would feel close, but only on the surface, relying on quick texts, social media interactions, and fleeting digital exchanges to sustain their relationships. This illusion of connection would rob them of depth. Conversations would become shorter, less meaningful, and often transactional. Over time, people would lose the skills needed for real connection: empathy, active listening, and the vulnerability required to truly know and be known. Constant connectivity thrives on interruptions. Notifications ding, vibrate, and flash, demanding attention in every waking moment. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that these interruptions feel urgent, even if they're not. Every ping would be a tiny nudge away from mindfulness, reflection, or prayer. In a world where silence is golden, I'd make it feel unbearable. The constant stream of updates would prevent people from sitting still long enough to ask the deeper questions. Who am I? What is my purpose? How can I draw closer to God? These are the questions that arise in stillness, and I'd make sure that stillness is drowned out by the clamor of connectivity. When people are always connected outwardly, they lose the opportunity to connect inwardly. The constant demands of technology would scatter their attention, leaving them unable to focus on their inner lives. They'd spend hours curating their online personas, seeking validation from likes and comments, while their true selves remain neglected and unknown. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that people become strangers to themselves. I'd keep them so busy scrolling, posting, and replying that they'd have no time to reflect on their thoughts, feelings, or spiritual needs. The deeper truths about their identity and purpose would fade into the background, overshadowed by the endless demands of digital life. Perhaps the most devastating consequence of constant connectivity is how it severs the connection to higher truths. In a world where every moment is filled with stimulation, there's no room for the quiet moments where divine whispers are heard. Reflection, prayer, and meditation require space, mental, emotional, and spiritual, and I'd ensure that space is consumed by the distractions of technology. Higher truths often come not in the rush of activity, but in the stillness of the soul. They emerge when the noise fades and the heart becomes receptive. If I were the devil, I'd keep people so plugged in that they never experience this stillness. The endless stream of information would leave them feeling informed but spiritually malnourished, connected but profoundly alone. The solution to this disconnection isn't to abandon technology, but to use it with intention. People must reclaim their time and attention, setting boundaries that prioritize depth over breadth, presence over distraction. This means silencing notifications, creating tech-free spaces, and intentionally carving out moments for reflection and connection with God. Imagine turning off the noise for just a moment and allowing silence to speak. Imagine rediscovering the beauty of real connection, with yourself, with others, and with the divine. This is the path to reclaiming higher truths in a world drowning in constant connectivity. The ultimate question is this: are we connecting, or are we distracting ourselves? True connection isn't found in the number of messages we send or the speed at which we respond. It's found in the quiet spaces where we can hear the voice of truth calling us back to what matters most. Chapter 3. Truth Twisted: Redefining Truth as Relative and Subjective. If I were the devil, I wouldn't need to eliminate truth altogether. That would be too obvious. Instead, I'd twist it, bend it just enough to make it unrecognizable, all while keeping people convinced they're holding onto something real. My goal wouldn't be to create outright lies, but to redefine truth as something malleable, subjective, and entirely personal. Truth would no longer be a guiding light, but a shadowy concept that shifts with perspective. Once, truth was seen as something solid, eternal, and universal. But if I were the devil, I'd erode that foundation brick by brick. I'd spread the idea that truth is fluid, that what's true for one person might not be true for another. I'd encourage phrases like my truth and your truth, making them sound empowering while subtly dismantling the concept of a shared reality. The brilliance of this tactic lies in its subtlety. People wouldn't see the danger in redefining truth as subjective. In fact, they'd celebrate it as a form of freedom to believe whatever feels right, regardless of whether it aligns with higher principles. And once absolute truth is dismissed, it becomes nearly impossible to discern what's real and what's illusion. Relativism, the idea that truth varies from person to person, is appealing because it removes accountability. If there's no absolute standard, there's no need to measure oneself against it. People can live as they please, making choices based on convenience or emotion rather than principle. If I were the devil, I'd promote relativism as the ultimate liberation. I'd make people feel enlightened for rejecting absolutes, framing it as a rejection of rigidity or judgment. In reality, it would be a rejection of clarity, leaving them adrift in a sea of conflicting opinions and fleeting feelings. The danger of subjective truth is that it prioritizes individual perspective over objective reality. It turns feelings into facts, allowing people to justify anything that aligns with their desires. If I were the devil, I'd use this to sow confusion. People would argue endlessly about what's true, dividing themselves into camps based on opinion rather than seeking a higher, unifying truth. This confusion wouldn't just affect individuals, it would ripple out into society. I'd ensure that communities, families, and even faith groups fracture over disagreements about what is real and what is right. Instead of working together to uncover truth, they'd spend their energy defending their personal versions of it. Redefining truth as relative is particularly effective in undermining faith. Most spiritual beliefs are rooted in the idea of an absolute truth, a divine standard that transcends human understanding. By twisting truth, I'd make these beliefs seem outdated, inflexible, or even oppressive. I'd convince people that faith is a personal experience, entirely subjective and disconnected from shared principles. Worship would become more about feelings than reverence, and morality would become a matter of personal preference. The more fragmented truth becomes, the harder it is for people to connect with God. The antidote to twisted truth is not rigid dogma, but a sincere search for what is real. People must learn to distinguish between what feels true and what is true, seeking wisdom from sources beyond themselves. This requires humility, the willingness to admit that one's own perspective might be limited or flawed. Imagine a world where truth is once again seen as something sacred, not as a tool for personal validation, but as a beacon to guide humanity. This doesn't mean abandoning individuality, but aligning personal experience with universal principles. The path back to truth begins with one question. What if there is something greater than my truth and your truth? What if there is the truth, waiting to be discovered? By rejecting the twisting of truth and embracing its higher form, people can move past confusion and division into a deeper, more unified understanding of life and faith. How subtle distortions of sacred teachings lead to spiritual apathy. If I were the devil, I wouldn't need to destroy sacred teachings outright. That would be too obvious, too crude. Instead, I'd subtly distort them, bending their meaning just enough to lead people astray without them realizing it. These small shifts wouldn't cause outrage or rebellion, but would quietly erode the foundation of faith over time. Before long, these distorted teachings would lose their transformative power, leaving people indifferent and spiritually apathetic. Sacred teachings are powerful because they provide clarity, guidance, and a connection to something greater. But they're also vulnerable to interpretation. If I were the devil, I'd use this vulnerability to my advantage. I'd encourage interpretations that focus on rules instead of relationships, guilt instead of grace, and rituals instead of genuine connection. These distortions would look and feel like faith, but would slowly drain the life out of it. For example, I'd emphasize legalism, making people believe that salvation depends solely on their ability to follow rules. This would turn faith into a burden rather than a source of joy. Over time, the weight of this distorted teaching would lead people to feel exhausted and disconnected, unable to experience the freedom that sacred teachings are meant to offer. Another effective tactic would be to twist sacred truths into rigid dogma. I'd ensure that people become so focused on the letter of the law that they forget the spirit behind it. This would create an environment where faith feels cold, transactional, and devoid of personal meaning. In such a world, people would stop asking questions, exploring, or seeking deeper understanding. They'd go through the motions of faith without ever engaging with its heart. The sacred would become routine, and spiritual apathy would quietly take hold. If I were the devil, I'd also distort sacred teachings to align with worldly desires. I'd promote a prosperity gospel that equates faith with material success, convincing people that God's blessings are measured in dollars and possessions. This would shift their focus from spiritual growth to personal gain, leaving them disillusioned when life doesn't go as planned. Alternatively, I'd frame faith as a self-help tool, reducing sacred teachings to motivational soundbites. While this approach might feel empowering, it would strip faith of its deeper purpose, turning it into a shallow means of self-improvement rather than a path to transformation. Love is central to most sacred teachings, but if I were the devil, I'd twist its meaning until it becomes unrecognizable. I'd reduce love to mere tolerance, encouraging people to avoid conflict or accountability in the name of peace. Real love, selfless, sacrificial, and rooted in truth, would fade into the background, replaced by a feel-good version that demands nothing and offers little in return. The subtle distortion of sacred teachings doesn't lead to immediate rebellion. It leads to slow disengagement. People might still identify with their faith, attend services, or recite prayers, but their hearts would no longer be in it. They'd go through the motions, not out of devotion, but out of habit or obligation. Over time, they'd begin to wonder why their faith feels empty and their connection to God so distant. Spiritual apathy is one of the devil's most effective tools because it keeps people stagnant. They don't reject God outright. They simply stop seeking Him. They lose the hunger for truth, the desire for growth, and the passion for transformation. And because the changes happen so gradually, they often don't realize what's been lost until it's too late. The way back from spiritual apathy begins with discernment. People must learn to recognize distortions for what they are and seek the original intent behind sacred teachings. This requires humility, curiosity, and a willingness to engage with faith on a deeper level. Imagine approaching sacred teachings not as rules to follow or rituals to perform, but as an invitation to relationship, a connection with the divine that transforms every aspect of life. By rejecting distortions and embracing the true heart of these teachings, people can rediscover the vitality and joy that spiritual apathy seeks to steal. The question is simple yet profound. Are we holding on to the truth, or are we clinging to a distorted version of it? In answering this, we take the first step toward reclaiming a faith that is alive, vibrant, and deeply connected to God. Chapter 4. Us versus them. Sowing division through polarization. If I were the devil, I wouldn't need to destroy humanity with war or calamity. I'd simply sow division, quietly, effectively, and relentlessly. I'd whisper ideas that pit people against one another, turning differences into battles and disagreements into irreconcilable conflicts. Religious, political, and social polarization would be my playground, creating an us versus them mentality that divides communities, families, and even faith groups. The genius of this strategy lies in its subtlety. People wouldn't recognize the division as destructive. They'd see it as righteous. They'd believe they were defending truth, justice, or morality, when in reality, they'd be tearing each other apart. Religion, meant to unify and elevate, is one of the easiest tools for division. If I were the devil, I'd twist sacred teachings just enough to fuel arguments over doctrine, interpretation, and practice. I'd make people believe their version of faith is the only correct one, encouraging them to judge and condemn those who believe differently. These divisions wouldn't just occur between religions, they'd thrive within them. Denominations, sects, and splinter groups would fight over theological nuances, forgetting the shared foundation of love, compassion, and humility. In their zeal to be right, they'd lose sight of God's ultimate call for unity and reconciliation. Politics offers another fertile ground for division. If I were the devil, I'd amplify ideological differences until they feel like personal attacks. I'd make people see those with opposing views not as fellow human beings, but as enemies. I'd encourage an environment where compromise is seen as weakness and where winning becomes more important than seeking truth or justice. Social media would be my weapon of choice, magnifying outrage and creating echo chambers where people only hear opinions that reinforce their beliefs. I'd use algorithms to feed their anger, ensuring they see every disagreement as a moral battle. Over time, The lines between political identity and personal identity would blur, leaving no room for empathy or understanding. Social issues, too, would become tools for division. Instead of fostering dialogue and progress, they'd become battlegrounds where people dig their heels in and refuse to listen. I'd ensure that every cause, no matter how noble, becomes polarizing. People would focus on proving their righteousness rather than finding common ground. If I were the devil, I'd turn movements for justice, equality, and human rights into opportunities for division. I'd ensure that even those working toward the same goals end up fighting over methodology, language, or leadership. The result would be chaos, a fractured society where progress is stifled by infighting. The most insidious part of division is how it feels justified. If I were the devil, I'd make people believe that their anger, judgment, and separation are necessary to defend their values. I'd ensure that every act of exclusion feels like an act of protection, every argument feels like a moral duty, and every enemy feels like a threat to truth. This illusion of righteous division is particularly powerful in religious and moral contexts. People wouldn't see their divisiveness as harmful. They'd see it as virtuous. And in their pursuit of righteousness, they'd forget the very principles of love, forgiveness, and unity that they claim to uphold. Division doesn't just isolate individuals, it fractures entire communities. Families are torn apart over political disagreements. Faith groups splinter into smaller and smaller factions. Social progress stalls as people fight among themselves instead of working together. The cost is immense, leaving people lonely, bitter, and disconnected from God and one another. Worse yet, division distracts from higher truths. While people argue over differences, they lose sight of their shared humanity and the larger purpose that unites them. They spend their energy defending their side instead of seeking wisdom, growth, or reconciliation. The antidote to division is not uniformity, but unity. It's possible to hold strong beliefs while respecting and understanding others. This requires humility, the willingness to admit that no one has all the answers, and empathy, the ability to see the world through another's eyes. Imagine a world where differences are celebrated rather than feared, where dialogue replaces debate, and where love triumphs over judgment. This doesn't mean abandoning truth or compromising values. It means approaching every interaction with grace, seeking connection instead of conflict. The question we must ask ourselves is this: are we building bridges or burning them? The us versus them mentality may feel satisfying in the moment, but it ultimately leaves us isolated, angry, and further from the truth. By rejecting division and embracing unity, we can begin to heal the fractures in our communities and reconnect with God's call for peace and reconciliation. The Devil's Playbook: turning differences into enmity. If I were the devil, I'd recognize that differences are inevitable. Humans are diverse by design. But differences themselves aren't the problem. They're natural, even beautiful. My real strategy would be to turn those differences into enmity. I wouldn't need to change the fact that people think differently, believe differently, or live differently. I'd only need to magnify those differences until they become walls that divide rather than bridges that connect. Step 1. Amplify fear of the other. The first step in my playbook would be to plant seeds of fear. I'd whisper to people that those who are different from them are a threat, threats to their values, their way of life, their safety. Fear is powerful because it shuts down empathy and encourages defensiveness. When people feel threatened, they stop seeing others as individuals and start seeing them as enemies. I'd use stereotypes and half-truths to build this fear, exaggerating the differences between groups. They don't think like you, I'd say. They don't share your values. They want to take what's yours. These fears would fester, making it easy for people to justify treating the other with suspicion or hostility. Step 2. Stoke pride and superiority. Next, I'd stroke people's egos. I'd convince them that their way of thinking, their beliefs, or their lifestyle is not just different but superior. You're right, I'd whisper. They're wrong. This sense of superiority would make it nearly impossible for them to engage in meaningful dialogue with those who disagree. If I were the devil, I'd frame humility as weakness and open-mindedness as betrayal. The more pride people feel in their own perspectives, the more they'll look down on others, and the easier it will be to turn differences into enmity. Step 3. Turn disagreements into personal attacks. Disagreements are natural, but I'd escalate them into personal attacks. I'd make every difference of opinion feel like an assault on identity. They don't just disagree with you, I'd whisper. They don't respect you. They don't value you. They're trying to tear you down. When disagreements become personal, people stop listening. They become defensive, hostile, and unwilling to find common ground. They see the other person not as a fellow human being, but as an adversary to be defeated. This is where enmity takes root. Step 4. Weaponize language. Words are powerful, and if I were the devil, I'd weaponize them. I'd encourage labels and insults that dehumanize the other. Words like enemy, evil, or ignorant would replace nuanced descriptions, making it easier to justify hatred or exclusion. I'd ensure that people use language not to communicate or understand, but to attack and divide. Social media would be my favorite tool: short, emotionally charged messages that spread anger and outrage like wildfire. Once people stop speaking to each other and start shouting past each other, the walls between them become nearly insurmountable. Step 5. Redefine unity as conformity. Unity is a threat to division, so I'd redefine it in a way that makes it unattainable. I'd convince people that unity means everyone has to think, believe, and act the same way. This false definition would make true unity, coexisting and working together despite differences, seem impossible. By equating unity with conformity, I'd ensure that people see differences as obstacles rather than opportunities for growth. They'd believe that the only way to achieve unity is for others to abandon their individuality and become more like them. Step 6. Normalize conflict and division. Finally, I'd normalize division to the point where it feels inevitable. I'd ensure that people see enmity as the natural state of the world, making them less likely to challenge it. This is just how things are, I'd whisper. It's always been us versus them, and it always will be. When division becomes normalized, people stop seeking solutions. They accept the brokenness of their relationships and communities as unchangeable. This resignation is the ultimate victory, as it ensures that the fractures remain unhealed. The devil's playbook thrives on the destruction of connection. When differences become enmity, people lose the ability to learn from one another, to grow through dialogue, and to build relationships rooted in love and respect. Communities fracture, families are torn apart, and individuals are left isolated and embittered. More tragically, this division creates a barrier between people and God. When enmity takes hold, it blocks the flow of compassion, forgiveness, and grace. It keeps people focused on their conflicts with others instead of their connection to the divine. The antidote to enmity is understanding. It's the willingness to see others as they truly are, not as enemies, but as fellow human beings created in the image of God. This doesn't mean ignoring differences or avoiding hard conversations. It means approaching those differences with humility, empathy, and a genuine desire to connect. Imagine a world where differences are celebrated rather than feared, where disagreements lead to growth rather than hostility. This is the path that dismantles the devil's playbook, turning walls into bridges and enmity into unity. The question is, are we willing to step off the battlefield and into a place of peace? By choosing understanding over division, we can reclaim the connections that the devil seeks to destroy and move closer to the truth and love that unite us all. Chapter 5. Materialism and the Pursuit of More. If I were the devil, I'd wrap the world in a glittering illusion, the promise that wealth and status can fill the void within. I'd make people believe that the next raise, the bigger house, or the newest gadget would finally bring them happiness and fulfillment. But I'd ensure that no matter how much they achieved or acquired, it would never be enough. This pursuit would feel endlessly satisfying in the moment, but would leave them emptier than ever. Materialism is alluring because it feels tangible. A new car, a luxury vacation, or a designer outfit can be seen, touched, and admired. Unlike the abstract rewards of spiritual growth or personal relationships, material possessions provide instant gratification. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that people equate material success with personal worth. You're only as valuable as what you own, I'd whisper, and they'd believe it. But materialism has a sinister edge. The satisfaction it brings is fleeting, like a drug that requires ever-increasing doses to achieve the same high. People would work harder, spend more, and sacrifice their time and relationships chasing a happiness that always remains just out of reach. They'd mistake the pursuit of wealth for purpose, never realizing that it's an endless treadmill leading nowhere. The pursuit of status is just as hollow as the pursuit of wealth, but it's even more insidious. If I were the devil, I'd make people believe that their value lies in how others perceive them. Social status, professional accolades, and public recognition would become the ultimate goals, eclipsing deeper, more meaningful pursuits. The problem with status is that it's entirely external. It depends not on who you are, but on how others see you. This leaves people vulnerable, constantly seeking validation and approval from others. They build their identities around the fragile opinions of their peers, leaving their sense of self at the mercy of the ever-changing tides of popularity and success. Materialism and the pursuit of status feel fulfilling because they tap into real human needs, the desire for security, recognition, and purpose. Owning a home, earning a promotion, or being celebrated by others can temporarily meet these needs, giving the illusion of fulfillment. If I were the devil, I'd amplify this illusion, ensuring that people mistake temporary pleasure for lasting joy. But true fulfillment doesn't come from possessions or status. It comes from connection, purpose, and growth. Materialism offers a counterfeit version of these deeper truths, keeping people distracted from what they really need. The pursuit of wealth and status comes with hidden costs. People sacrifice their time, health, and relationships in their quest for more. They miss out on the simple joys of life, moments with loved ones, quiet reflection, and opportunities to serve others, because they're too busy chasing the next milestone. Worse still, materialism creates a barrier between people and God. When life revolves around acquiring and achieving, there's little room left for gratitude, humility, or spiritual growth. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that materialism feels so satisfying that people never stop to question what it's costing them. One of the cruelest tricks of materialism is that enough is always just out of reach. No matter how much wealth or status people accumulate, there's always something more to strive for: a bigger house, a higher position, or a greater number of followers. This endless pursuit leaves people feeling restless, dissatisfied, and deeply unfulfilled. If I were the devil, I'd make sure that people never realize this. I'd keep them so focused on what they don't have that they never appreciate what they do. Gratitude would be replaced by envy, and contentment would feel like complacency. Breaking free from the allure of materialism requires a shift in perspective. People must learn to see wealth and status not as ends in themselves, but as tools to be used in service of a greater purpose. This means focusing on what truly matters: relationships, experiences, and spiritual growth. Imagine a life where the pursuit of more is replaced by the pursuit of meaning. Instead of chasing possessions or accolades, people could invest in the things that bring lasting joy, acts of kindness, moments of connection, and a sense of purpose that transcends material success. The question is this: are we building a life that looks good from the outside or one that feels good on the inside? By rejecting the false fulfillment of materialism and embracing the deeper truths of love, gratitude, and purpose, we can find a joy that wealth and status could never provide. The trap of defining success by external achievements. If I were the devil, I'd redefine success in the simplest yet most destructive way, by tying it entirely to external achievements. I'd make people believe that their worth is measured by their titles, possessions, and accolades. I'd convince them that success isn't about who they are, but about what they have and what they've done. The more they chase this definition of success, the further they drift from the truth and from themselves. External achievements are alluring because they're visible. Promotions, awards, luxury items, and public recognition are all tangible markers of success. If I were the devil, I'd make sure these markers are celebrated loudly and consistently. People would grow up believing that their value lies in how they stack up against others, creating a lifetime of striving for external validation. What makes this trap so effective is how it feels rewarding. A new job title, a flashy car, or a perfectly curated social media feed provides immediate gratification. It looks like progress, but it's often a shallow substitute for deeper fulfillment. People would spend years climbing the ladder of success, only to realize too late that it's leaning against the wrong wall. External achievements are inherently fragile because they depend on factors beyond one's control. If I were the devil, I'd make sure people base their self-worth on things that can easily be taken away. A downturn in the economy, a failed business venture, or a shift in public opinion would be enough to shatter their sense of identity. This fragility creates a cycle of anxiety and insecurity. People would constantly fear losing what they've worked so hard to achieve, leaving them in a perpetual state of striving and never arriving. Instead of finding peace in their accomplishments, they'd find only pressure to achieve more. Defining success by external achievements doesn't just disconnect people from themselves, it also disconnects them from God. When life revolves around climbing the ladder, there's little room for reflection or gratitude. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that people are so busy chasing success that they forget to ask deeper questions. What is my purpose? How can I serve others? What does success look like in the eyes of God? By focusing solely on external achievements, people would neglect the internal work of character, wisdom, and spiritual growth. They'd build impressive lives on the outside while feeling empty on the inside, mistaking the applause of the world for the approval of their Creator. One of the most effective traps in this playbook is the false promise of future happiness. I'll be happy when I get that promotion, they think. I'll feel successful when I make more money, buy that house, or gain recognition for my work. But if I were the devil, I'd ensure that each milestone is followed by a new one, leaving people perpetually chasing a happiness that never arrives. This mindset blinds people to the joy and meaning available in the present moment. They're so focused on what's next that they fail to appreciate what they already have. Gratitude becomes an afterthought, and contentment feels like failure. The relentless pursuit of external success often comes at a great cost. Relationships suffer when work becomes the only priority. Health declines when stress and overwork take their toll. And spiritual lives wither when achievements become the sole focus. If I were the devil, I'd make sure these costs remain hidden until it's too late, ensuring that people sacrifice the things that truly matter on the altar of external success. Breaking free from this trap requires redefining success. True success isn't about what we achieve, but who we become. It's measured not by the size of our bank accounts or the titles on our resumes, but by the quality of our relationships, the depth of our character, and the impact we make on the world. Imagine a world where success is defined not by external markers, but by internal growth. People would focus on living with integrity, kindness, and purpose, finding fulfillment in the things that money and status can't buy. They'd see their achievements as tools to serve others rather than as measures of their worth. The question is this: are we chasing success that fades, or are we building a legacy that lasts? By shifting our focus from external achievements to eternal values, we can escape the trap of false success and discover the joy of living in alignment with our higher purpose. Chapter 6: Spiritual Substitutes, New Age Philosophies, and Self-Help as Distractions. If I were the devil, I wouldn't discourage people from pursuing spirituality altogether. That would be too obvious. Instead, I'd offer them substitutes, paths that feel spiritual but ultimately lead nowhere. New Age philosophies and self-help would be my tools of choice, promising enlightenment, fulfillment, and transformation without the commitment, accountability, or surrender that true spiritual growth requires. These substitutes wouldn't look like distractions, they'd look like solutions. Spiritual substitutes are enticing because they feel empowering. New Age philosophies often focus on self-discovery, energy alignment, or vague notions of universal connection, offering people a sense of control over their spiritual journey. Similarly, self-help books and seminars promise quick fixes to life's problems, framing personal growth as a solo endeavor. If I were the devil, I'd make sure these substitutes feel good. So good that people mistake temporary relief for lasting transformation. I'd ensure they focus on individual empowerment, steering them away from the humility and surrender needed for deeper connection with God. Spiritual substitutes would be like cotton candy, sweet and satisfying in the moment, but ultimately empty and unfulfilling. New Age philosophies often blend elements of various spiritual traditions, presenting a buffet of feel-good ideas without the deeper truths that anchor them. If I were the devil, I'd make sure these philosophies are vague enough to avoid accountability, but relatable enough to draw people in. The universe has your back, I'd say, leaving people with the comforting illusion of control while keeping them disconnected from the reality of a higher power. These philosophies often focus on individual energy, manifestation, or the idea that you are your own God. They strip away the need for community, discipline, or even objective truth, leaving people adrift in a sea of self-created spirituality. And while they may bring moments of peace or clarity, they often lack the transformative power of a faith rooted in something greater than the self. Self-help is another powerful tool in the devil's playbook. If I were the devil, I'd use this industry to convince people that they can achieve everything they need through sheer willpower and positive thinking. I'd make self-improvement seem like the ultimate goal, ensuring that people focus on fixing themselves rather than seeking connection with God. The problem with self-help is that it often treats symptoms without addressing root causes. It encourages people to change their habits, thoughts, or behaviors without ever asking deeper questions about their purpose or identity. I'd make sure that self-help keeps people busy with endless strategies and routines, leaving them no time to reflect on the spiritual void they're trying to fill. Spiritual substitutes are effective because they offer an illusion of growth without the challenges of true transformation. If I were the devil, I'd make sure they appeal to the ego, focusing on self-empowerment rather than surrender. People would feel like they're making progress, but they'd remain trapped in a cycle of superficial change. True spiritual growth requires humility, discipline, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. It calls for connection with a higher power, accountability within a community, and the surrender of the ego. Spiritual substitutes bypass all of this, offering an easier path that ultimately leads nowhere. The greatest danger of spiritual substitutes is that they leave people spiritually stagnant. They create the illusion of fulfillment, keeping people from seeking the deeper connection they truly need. Over time, the cracks begin to show. The practices that once felt uplifting start to feel hollow, and the sense of control they offered begins to fade. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that people blame themselves for this emptiness rather than questioning the validity of their chosen path. They'd double down on their efforts, trying harder to find meaning in practices that were never designed to provide it. The way out of this trap is to recognize the difference between spiritual substitutes and true spiritual growth. The former centers on the self, while the latter calls us beyond ourselves. True growth requires surrendering control, seeking guidance, and opening ourselves to a power greater than we can imagine. Imagine trading the fleeting comfort of substitutes for the lasting peace of genuine connection. This doesn't mean rejecting self-help or New Age ideas entirely. It means approaching them with discernment, recognizing their limitations, and seeking a deeper foundation. The question is this: are we pursuing spirituality that transforms us, or are we settling for practices that merely comfort us? By moving beyond substitutes and embracing the challenge of true growth, we can find the deeper fulfillment that these distractions can never provide. True spirituality is not about self-reliance. It's about connection, transformation, and surrender to something far greater than ourselves. The danger of feel-good spirituality that lacks accountability or transformation. If I were the devil, I'd make spirituality feel good but lack substance. I wouldn't discourage people from pursuing it. In fact, I'd encourage it, but I'd ensure their efforts stay shallow. Their spirituality would make them feel warm and inspired but never challenged or changed. It would be an emotional high, not a transformative journey. Most importantly, it would be a path without accountability, where growth is optional and truth is subjective. Feel-good spirituality is seductive because it offers comfort without cost. It emphasizes love and light, peace and positivity, while glossing over the harder aspects of growth: discipline, sacrifice, and self-examination. If I were the devil, I'd make sure this version of spirituality is easy to access and easy to follow. No commitment would be necessary. All you'd need to do is believe in vague notions of good vibes and universal energy. This kind of spirituality feels good because it centers on the self. It tells people that they are already perfect, that they don't need to change, and that all they need to do is align or manifest their desires. While these ideas might offer temporary relief, they leave people unprepared for life's inevitable challenges and disconnected from the deeper truths that bring real transformation. One of the most dangerous aspects of feel-good spirituality is its lack of accountability. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that no one feels obligated to examine their actions, confront their flaws, or strive for anything beyond personal comfort. I'd frame accountability as judgment and discipline as oppression, ensuring that people reject any system or community that challenges them to grow. Without accountability, spirituality becomes a self-serving pursuit. People might feel spiritual, but their lives remain unchanged. They avoid the difficult work of transformation, the kind that requires humility, repentance, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. This lack of accountability keeps them stuck, unable to move closer to God or their higher purpose. True spirituality is transformative. It changes how we see ourselves, how we treat others, and how we navigate the world. But feel-good spirituality often stops at inspiration, providing a fleeting sense of peace or positivity without leading to real growth. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that people mistake these fleeting feelings for progress, leaving them content to stay where they are. Transformation requires discomfort. It asks us to confront our weaknesses, let go of our egos, and embrace a higher standard of living. Feel-good spirituality avoids all of this, offering an easier path that feels good in the moment but leaves the soul unfulfilled. Feel-good spirituality often places the self at the center. It's about what makes me feel good, what aligns with my energy, what manifests my desires. If I were the devil, I'd make sure that people see spirituality as a tool for self-fulfillment rather than a call to selflessness. They'd focus on what they can get from their spiritual practices rather than what they can give. This self-focused approach creates a false sense of empowerment. People might feel in control of their spiritual journeys, but they're often just circling around their own egos. True spirituality calls us to something greater than ourselves, but feel-good spirituality keeps us trapped in a cycle of self-absorption. The most dangerous aspect of feel-good spirituality is the illusion of growth. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that people feel like they're making progress even when they're standing still. I'd encourage practices that look spiritual, like meditation, affirmations, or energy work, but don't challenge the deeper parts of the soul. People would feel enlightened without ever confronting the shadows within. This illusion keeps people from seeking more. They believe they've already arrived, so they never ask, "What's next?" Or "What am I missing?" The path feels fulfilling, but it leads nowhere. The antidote to feel-good spirituality is a return to depth and accountability. True spirituality requires us to step outside our comfort zones, to seek not just what feels good, but what is good. This means embracing practices that challenge us: prayer, reflection, community, and service, and being open to the ways they transform us. Imagine a spirituality that doesn't just inspire but equips, a path that helps us face life's challenges with courage, humility, and grace. This kind of spirituality calls us to grow, to serve, and to connect with something greater than ourselves. The question is this: are we seeking comfort or transformation? By moving beyond feel-good spirituality and embracing the challenges of true growth, we can find a deeper, more lasting connection to God and to our higher purpose. True spirituality isn't about avoiding the hard work. It's about finding the strength to do it. Chapter 7. Using suffering as a weapon, convincing people that hardship is proof of God's absence. If I were the devil, I'd take life's inevitable hardships and turn them into my most powerful weapon. Pain is universal, and in its rawness, it has the power to shape people's beliefs. Instead of allowing suffering to draw people closer to God, I'd twist its meaning, convincing them that their struggles are evidence of His absence, indifference, or cruelty. My goal wouldn't be to eliminate faith outright, but to erode it slowly, one unanswered prayer, one heartbreak, one tragedy at a time. Suffering is a part of the human experience, touching everyone in different ways. If I were the devil, I'd capitalize on this universal truth. Loss, illness, betrayal, and disappointment would be my tools, not because they create pain. Pain is inevitable, but because they create questions. Why did this happen to me? Why does God allow suffering? If I can nudge those questions toward bitterness and despair, I can begin to sever the connection between people and their Creator. The first step in my strategy would be to magnify doubt. I'd plant thoughts like, if God is good, why does He let bad things happen? Or if He truly loved you, wouldn't He intervene? These questions would feel natural, even justified, but they'd carry an undercurrent of accusation. Over time, this doubt would chip away at people's trust in God. I'd also amplify the silence. In moments of deepest pain, when people cry out for help and hear nothing in return, I'd whisper, "See? He doesn't care. You're on your own." The longer the silence lasts, the louder their doubts would grow, until faith feels like a distant memory. If I were the devil, I'd make sure people interpret God's perceived inaction as indifference. I'd frame their suffering as evidence that they've been abandoned. If He's all-powerful, He could stop this, I'd whisper. If He's all-loving, He wouldn't let you suffer. This illusion would shift the focus away from the complexity of God's plans and onto the immediacy of their pain. By narrowing their perspective, I'd make it impossible for people to see the ways God might be working through their hardship. They wouldn't recognize the growth, resilience, or deeper understanding that often comes from suffering. All they'd see is the pain. Another tactic would be to encourage comparison. I'd make people look at the lives of others and wonder why their own suffering feels so much greater. Look at them, I'd say. They're happy, successful, and at peace. Why not you? This comparison would deepen their feelings of injustice and isolation, driving a wedge between them and God. Faith is often strongest in times of need, but if I were the devil, I'd twist it into a transactional relationship. I'd make people believe that their prayers are contracts with God, that if they do everything right, God owes them a life free from pain. When those prayers seem unanswered, they'd feel betrayed. You kept your end of the bargain, I'd whisper. Why didn't he keep his? This distorted view of faith would leave them disillusioned, as if their suffering were evidence of a broken promise rather than an opportunity for deeper connection. The ultimate goal of this strategy would be to isolate people. Pain has the power to connect, but if I were the devil, I'd ensure it creates distance instead. I'd make people withdraw from their communities, their loved ones, and their faith, believing that no one understands their struggles and that God has turned his back on them. Isolation breeds despair, and despair is where hope withers. Without hope, people lose sight of God's presence, even when it's closer than ever. The antidote to this weapon is perspective. Suffering, when viewed through the lens of faith, becomes a tool for growth rather than a weapon for destruction. It's not a sign of God's absence, but an invitation to trust him more deeply. Imagine seeing pain not as punishment, but as preparation, a way to build resilience, deepen empathy, and strengthen faith. This doesn't diminish the reality of suffering, but it places it within the context of a greater story. God's silence isn't abandonment. It's often a call to seek him more earnestly, to find him in the stillness. The key to overcoming the weaponization of suffering is trust. Trust that God's plan is bigger than our understanding. Trust that pain has a purpose, even when it's not immediately clear. And trust that his love is present even in life's darkest moments. The question isn't whether we'll face suffering. It's inevitable. The question is whether we'll let it drive us away from God or draw us closer to him. By rejecting the lies that pain is proof of his absence, we can reclaim suffering as a path to deeper faith, greater understanding, and unshakable hope. The temptation to blame God for human failings. If I were the devil, I'd exploit one of humanity's most natural tendencies, the need to find someone to blame. In a world full of injustice, pain, and disappointment, pointing fingers is easy. And who better to blame than God? I'd take the failures of humanity, greed, cruelty, and selfishness, and redirect the anger and disillusionment they cause squarely onto him. It's a perfect strategy because it shifts accountability away from human actions while creating a barrier between people and their creator. When faced with human suffering, it's tempting to ask, why would God allow this? If I were the devil, I'd ensure that question dominates their thoughts. I'd make people focus not on the choices and systems created by humans, but on God's perceived inaction. I'd encourage thoughts like, if he's all-powerful, shouldn't he have stopped this? Or if he loves us, why does he let people hurt each other? This shift in responsibility is subtle but devastating. Instead of holding themselves or others accountable, people would begin to see God as distant, indifferent, or even complicit in human failings. They wouldn't question their role in perpetuating injustice. They'd question his. The most effective way to turn people against God is to use the actions of others, especially those who claim to represent him. Religious hypocrisy, corruption, and judgmental attitudes are fertile ground for disillusionment. If I were the devil, I'd amplify the mistakes of religious leaders and institutions, ensuring they overshadow the good they do. I'd whisper, if this is what faith looks like, why bother? Or if these people represent God, how can he be worth following? People would begin to equate human failings with divine failure, abandoning their faith not because of God's actions, but because of the actions of those who claim to know him. Human failings often lead to suffering, and when justice feels absent, it's easy to blame God. If I were the devil, I'd magnify the world's injustices, poverty, inequality, violence, while convincing people that God is doing nothing about them. I'd make them feel helpless and abandoned, turning their anger toward the one being who could truly offer them hope. This tactic works because it focuses on what's missing rather than what's present. Instead of seeing God's grace, love, and guidance in the midst of chaos, people would only see the chaos. Instead of asking how they can be instruments of change, they demand to know why God hasn't fixed everything already. When people are hurt by others, betrayed by a friend, abused by a partner, or abandoned by a parent, I'd encourage them to direct their bitterness upward. Why did God let this happen? I'd whisper, If he cared about you, wouldn't he have protected you? This bitterness would grow like a seed, rooting itself deep in their hearts. Over time, it would become a barrier to healing, preventing them from seeing God as a source of comfort and strength. Instead of turning to him in their pain, they'd turn away, convinced that he's to blame for their suffering. If I were the devil, I'd obscure the concept of free will. I'd make people forget that much of the suffering in the world stems from human choices. I'd encourage them to see God not as a being who grants freedom, but as a puppet master responsible for everything that happens. By twisting their understanding of free will, I'd create confusion and resentment. People would struggle to reconcile their pain with God's goodness, never realizing that their anger might be better directed at the human systems, choices, and failings that caused their suffering in the first place. Blaming God for human failings has a profound cost. It severs the relationship between people and their Creator. Instead of seeking His guidance and comfort, they distance themselves, caught in a cycle of anger and disillusionment. This separation leaves them isolated, unable to find the peace and healing they need. Blame also prevents accountability. If people see God as the source of their problems, they're less likely to reflect on their own role in creating or perpetuating them. This lack of accountability stifles growth, both individually and collectively. The antidote to this temptation is perspective. Understanding the distinction between human failings and divine purpose requires humility and reflection. God doesn't promise to shield us from every consequence of human actions. He promises to walk with us through them, offering wisdom, strength, and hope. Imagine viewing suffering not as evidence of God's absence, but as a call to action, a chance to bring light into dark places, to embody His love and grace. By shifting the focus from blame to partnership, people can begin to see themselves as co-creators of a better world. The question isn't, why doesn't God fix this? But, how can we partner with Him to fix this? By recognizing human failings for what they are and refusing to blame God for them, people can move from bitterness to purpose. They can see their pain not as a punishment, but as an opportunity to grow, to heal, and to make a difference. The devil's strategy thrives on blame because blame divides, but accountability unites. By rejecting the temptation to hold God responsible for human failings, we open the door to deeper connection, greater healing, and the kind of transformation that only comes through grace. Chapter 8. Hypocrisy and Disillusionment. How failures within religious institutions are exploited to drive people away from faith. If I were the devil, I wouldn't attack faith directly. That's too obvious, too likely to backfire. Instead, I'd target its representatives. Religious institutions are built on trust, integrity, and moral leadership, but they're also made up of flawed human beings. I'd shine a spotlight on every failure, every misstep, and every act of hypocrisy, using them to sow seeds of disillusionment. When people see leaders falling short, they're tempted to question not just the individuals, but the very faith those leaders represent. Hypocrisy within religious institutions is particularly damaging because of the expectations placed upon them. If I were the devil, I'd exploit this high standard. When leaders preach love but practice judgment, or speak of humility while chasing power and wealth, their actions create a dissonance that's hard to ignore. I'd magnify this dissonance, ensuring that it overshadows the good work being done by others. I'd make people forget the countless acts of kindness, charity, and sacrifice carried out in the name of faith, focusing instead on the most publicized failures. The greater the gap between what's preached and what's practiced, the easier it becomes for people to turn away. I wouldn't have to convince them that God isn't real, only that His representatives are unworthy of trust. Scandals within religious institutions, financial misconduct, abuse of power, or moral failings are powerful tools for driving people away from faith. If I were the devil, I'd amplify these stories, ensuring they dominate headlines and conversations. The more people see institutions failing to live up to their ideals, the more likely they are to associate faith itself with corruption and deceit. Scandals also create a ripple effect. Even those who aren't directly affected may begin to question their beliefs, wondering how a supposedly divine institution could fall so far. I'd use these moments to plant doubts, not just about the institution, but about the God it claims to serve. Disillusionment begins with disappointment. When people place their trust in religious leaders or institutions, they often see them as representatives of God. When those leaders fail, the betrayal feels personal, as if God Himself has let them down. If I were the devil, I'd exploit this feeling, encouraging thoughts like, if they can't live up to their beliefs, how can those beliefs be true? Over time, this disappointment turns into cynicism. People become jaded, seeing all religious institutions as inherently flawed and all leaders as hypocrites. They disengage from their faith, not because they've rejected God, but because they've lost faith in the people who claim to represent Him. Faith is often nurtured within a community. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that the failures of a few make people distrust the whole. You don't need them, I'd whisper. You're better off on your own. The isolation that follows leaves people vulnerable, disconnected from the support and accountability that community provides. Without community, faith becomes harder to sustain. The shared rituals, encouragement, and sense of belonging that strengthen belief are replaced by loneliness and doubt. The failures of religious institutions would serve as a wedge, separating people from the very relationships that could help them navigate their struggles. The irony of hypocrisy is that it often reveals the very truths it seeks to obscure. When religious leaders fall short, it's not proof that faith is false, but that humans are fallible. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that people miss this distinction. I'd make them believe that the failures of individuals discredit the message they preach, rather than seeing those failures as reminders of humanity's need for grace. The antidote to disillusionment is discernment, the ability to separate God from the people who claim to represent Him. People must recognize that religious institutions, like all human organizations, are imperfect. They're capable of great good and great harm, but their failures don't negate the truth of the faith they're built upon. Imagine approaching faith with open eyes, acknowledging the flaws of its human representatives while holding onto the deeper truths it points to. This perspective allows people to engage with their faith honestly, without idealizing or dismissing it entirely. Disillusionment is painful, but it doesn't have to be the end of faith. It can be an opportunity to grow, to deepen one's understanding, and to seek God beyond the limitations of human institutions. By choosing resilience over cynicism, people can reclaim their connection to God, even in the face of hypocrisy. The question is, will we let the failures of others drive us away from faith, or will we use them as reminders of why we need it? By rejecting the temptation to equate human failings with divine failure, we can hold on to the hope, grace, and truth that no scandal can diminish. Faith isn't about perfect people. It's about a perfect God working through imperfect people. Stories of those who turned from God, betrayal and disappointment. If I were the devil, I'd weave betrayal and disappointment into the lives of the faithful, then amplify their pain until it becomes unbearable. It's not the grand tragedies that turn people from God, it's the personal ones. The betrayal of trust by a spiritual leader. The cold indifference of a religious community. The silence in response to a desperate prayer. These are the moments where faith falters, where the seeds of doubt take root. Every story of someone turning from God has a common thread: pain that feels unacknowledged, unanswered, or unresolved. I'd ensure that pain becomes a barrier, isolating them from the comfort and hope they seek. One of the most devastating experiences is the betrayal of trust by someone who represents God. A pastor caught in a scandal, a mentor who falls short of their ideals, or a religious institution embroiled in corruption. All of these shake the foundations of faith. Take Sarah, for example. She grew up in a tight-knit church community, trusting her pastor as a moral guide. When news broke of his financial misconduct, it wasn't just the church that felt broken. It was her belief in the integrity of her faith. If he can't live what he preaches, how can I believe any of it? She wondered. Slowly, Sarah distanced herself, not only from her church but from God, unable to separate the actions of a flawed human from the divine. For others, the turning point isn't a betrayal by a leader, but the indifference of a community. When James lost his job and struggled to make ends meet, he turned to his church for support. Instead of receiving compassion, he felt judged for his failure. "They told me to pray harder," he said, "but what I needed was help paying my bills." James left the church feeling hurt and abandoned. Over time, that hurt transformed into bitterness, not just toward the people who failed him, but toward the God they claimed to represent. For many, the silence of God during moments of desperation becomes the breaking point. Maria had prayed fervently for her son to recover from a terminal illness. She begged God for a miracle, clinging to her faith with every ounce of strength she had. When her son passed away, she felt shattered, not just by her loss, but by what she perceived as God's absence. "If God is good, why didn't He save him?" she asked. The pain of that unanswered prayer created a chasm that Maria couldn't bridge, leaving her feeling betrayed by the very source of her hope. Disillusionment often stems from unmet expectations. For years, Paul believed that following God would shield him from hardship. When his marriage fell apart and his business failed, he felt abandoned and disillusioned. "I thought faith was supposed to make life better," he said. "Instead, it feels like I'm worse off than ever." Paul's story is not unique. Many who turn away from God do so not out of rebellion, but because their pain clouds their understanding of His presence. They feel as though their suffering invalidates the promises they believed in, leaving them lost and unsure of where to turn. If I were the devil, I'd be present in each of these stories, whispering doubts and accusations. See, I'd say, God doesn't care about you. You're on your own. I'd magnify their pain, ensuring they see it as evidence of God's absence rather than an invitation to seek Him more deeply. I'd encourage them to replace faith with cynicism, to withdraw from the very relationships and practices that could help them heal. Over time, their stories of betrayal and disappointment would become barriers, preventing them from ever returning to the faith they once held dear. The most tragic part of these stories is how they often end, with people walking away from God, unaware of how He was present even in their pain. But these stories don't have to end in disconnection. They can be rewritten into narratives of redemption, healing, and transformation. Imagine Sarah finding a community that restores her faith and integrity, or James encountering a church that offers both spiritual and practical support. Imagine Maria discovering that God's silence wasn't absence, but a call to trust Him in ways she'd never imagined. These rewritten stories are possible, but only if the barriers of betrayal and disappointment are acknowledged and addressed. The path back to faith begins with understanding that human failings and unmet expectations don't negate God's love. Betrayal and disappointment are real, but they don't have to define the story. When people confront their pain honestly, bringing it to God rather than using it as a reason to walk away, they open the door to healing. The question isn't, "Why did this happen to me?" but "What is God calling me to learn, to trust, to grow through this?" By reframing pain as part of a larger narrative, people can begin to see the hand of God even in their darkest moments. Every story of disillusionment carries within it the seeds of redemption. By addressing the wounds caused by betrayal and disappointment, we can help others rewrite their narratives, turning their pain into a testimony of resilience, grace, and renewed faith. The devil may use suffering to drive people away, but God can use it to draw them closer, if they're willing to let Him. Chapter 9. Complacency over conviction, encouraging apathy as the enemy of transformation. If I were the devil, I wouldn't need to convince people to hate God or reject faith outright. That takes too much effort. Instead, I'd encourage complacency. I'd whisper in their ears, "You're good enough. You don't need to change. You've already done all you need to do." This subtle manipulation would be my masterpiece because it feels so safe, so comfortable, so reasonable. Why strive for transformation when the status quo feels sufficient? Complacency is one of the most effective tools to keep people spiritually stagnant. It creates a false sense of satisfaction, convincing people that they've arrived when, in truth, they've only just begun. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that people measure their spiritual lives by external markers, attending services, reciting prayers, or performing good deeds, while neglecting the deeper work of transformation. This mindset is seductive because it offers relief from the discomfort of growth. Transformation requires vulnerability, effort, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Complacency, on the other hand, is easy. It allows people to stay where they are, mistaking comfort for contentment and activity for purpose. One of complacency's greatest tricks is creating the illusion of progress. People might feel they're doing enough because they participate in rituals or belong to a faith community. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that these outward practices remain just that, outward. They'd go through the motions but never engage their hearts or minds fully. Take Alex, for instance. He attends church every week, gives to charity, and prays before meals. From the outside, he appears devout. But internally, his faith is stagnant. He hasn't examined his beliefs in years, hasn't wrestled with doubts, and hasn't grown in compassion or humility. Alex's faith feels alive, but it's quietly withering under the weight of routine. Complacency thrives on a lack of urgency. If I were the devil, I'd convince people that there's always more time. Time to seek God, time to make changes, time to grow. You can start tomorrow, I'd whisper. There's no rush. Over time, tomorrow turns into next week, next year, or never. This delay is deadly to transformation because growth requires action. People lose sight of their potential and settle for less than they're capable of, all because the present moment doesn't feel urgent enough to act upon. Complacency often masks a deeper fear, the fear of change. Growth requires letting go of old habits, beliefs, and ways of thinking. It demands stepping into the unknown, which can be terrifying. If I were the devil, I'd amplify this fear, making change seem risky and unnecessary. Why rock the boat? I'd whisper, you're doing just fine. By disguising this fear as contentment, I'd ensure that people never step outside their comfort zones. They'd avoid the challenges that lead to transformation, clinging instead to a false sense of stability. The cost of complacency is immense. It keeps people from experiencing the fullness of their potential, from deepening their relationship with God, and from making meaningful contributions to the world. Over time, this stagnation breeds apathy, leaving them spiritually disconnected and unfulfilled. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that people never recognize these costs. I'd keep them focused on their small victories and superficial achievements, ensuring they never ask the deeper questions. Am I growing? Am I serving? Am I truly alive in my faith? The antidote to complacency is conviction. Conviction stirs the soul, igniting a desire for growth and transformation. It challenges people to examine their lives honestly, to confront their weaknesses, and to strive for something greater. Imagine living with a sense of holy urgency, not out of fear but out of purpose. Imagine seeing every moment as an opportunity to grow, to serve, and to connect more deeply with God. This mindset shifts the focus from good enough to what's next. It replaces apathy with passion and comfort with purpose. The question isn't whether we're doing enough, it's whether we're becoming enough. Complacency whispers that we've arrived, but conviction reminds us that the journey is ongoing. By choosing growth over comfort, we can break free from the subtle trap of complacency and step into the transformative power of a life fully lived. The devil's strategy thrives on keeping people stagnant. But God's call is one of movement, change, and growth. The choice is ours. Will we settle for good enough, or will we rise to the challenge of transformation? The illusion of self-sufficiency, believing one can thrive without God. If I were the devil, I'd plant one powerful idea in the minds of humanity: the belief that they don't need God. I'd encourage them to see themselves as entirely self-sufficient, capable of achieving success, happiness, and fulfillment on their own terms. This illusion of independence would be my masterpiece because it feels empowering on the surface while quietly pulling people further from the source of true life and purpose. The illusion of self-sufficiency is enticing because it flatters the ego. It whispers, you're strong enough. You're smart enough. You don't need anyone else. In a world that celebrates individualism and self-reliance, this message feels natural, even virtuous. If I were the devil, I'd amplify this cultural narrative. I'd equate dependence with weakness and frame trust in God as a crutch for the incapable. People would pride themselves on their autonomy, unaware that their achievements, though impressive, rest on a foundation they cannot see. At the heart of self-sufficiency is the desire for control. People want to believe they're the masters of their own destinies, that their success is the result of their effort, talent, and determination alone. If I were the devil, I'd encourage this belief, ensuring they see their lives as entirely self-made. But control is an illusion. Circumstances can change in an instant. A health crisis, a natural disaster, or an unexpected loss can shatter the carefully constructed sense of autonomy. When life feels stable, self-sufficiency seems plausible. But in moments of upheaval, its fragility is exposed. Self-sufficiency doesn't typically result in outright rejection of God. Instead, it creates a slow, subtle disconnection. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that people don't deny God's existence. They simply stop seeing him as relevant to their daily lives. You've got this, I'd whisper. Why bother him with your problems? Over time, this mindset erodes faith. Prayer feels unnecessary, reflection feels like a waste of time, and spiritual growth becomes an afterthought. People may still claim to believe in God, but their actions show they've placed their trust elsewhere, often in themselves. The greatest danger of self-sufficiency is the isolation it creates. When people believe they can thrive without God, they also begin to distance themselves from others. I don't need anyone, they think. I can handle this on my own. This mindset may feel empowering, but it leaves them vulnerable, disconnected from the support and community that foster growth and resilience. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that self-sufficiency feels liberating, even as it quietly isolates people from the relationships and resources they truly need. They'd mistake solitude for strength, all the while growing weaker in the absence of connection. The illusion of self-sufficiency comes at a high cost. It creates a sense of independence that, while satisfying in the short term, leaves people unprepared for life's challenges. When the inevitable storms come, they find themselves without an anchor, struggling to stay afloat. Worse still, self-sufficiency blinds people to their need for grace. If I were the devil, I'd make them believe they don't need forgiveness, guidance, or redemption. They'd focus entirely on their own abilities, missing the deeper truth that their strength is a gift, not an entitlement. The antidote to self-sufficiency is humility. It's the recognition that, while human effort is important, it's not enough on its own. True thriving comes from acknowledging our dependence on God, not as a sign of weakness, but as a source of strength. Imagine seeing dependence not as a limitation, but as a partnership. By trusting in God's wisdom, provision, and love, people can experience a freedom that self-sufficiency could never offer. It's not about giving up control entirely. It's about recognizing who truly holds the reins. The question isn't whether we're capable, it's whether we're connected. Self-sufficiency isolates, but faith unites. By embracing the truth that we are stronger together, with God and with others, we can move beyond the illusion of independence and into a life of deeper meaning and purpose. The devil's strategy thrives on convincing people they can go it alone. But true fulfillment comes not from standing alone, but from walking in step with God. The choice is clear. Will we cling to the illusion of self-sufficiency, or will we embrace the freedom and connection found in dependence? Chapter 10. The Self as God, glorifying self-worship and individualism over humility and service. If I were the devil, I'd make self-worship the most enticing religion of all. I wouldn't need idols or altars. I'd place the pedestal within every person's heart and whisper, "You are enough. You are all you need." I'd glorify individualism and self-reliance, ensuring that people see themselves, their desires, and their achievements as the ultimate purpose. Over time, this subtle shift from humility to self-centeredness would turn hearts away from service, connection, and God. Self-worship thrives in a culture that celebrates individualism. Follow your heart, do what makes you happy, and you deserve it are the mantras of this movement. If I were the devil, I'd amplify these messages, making them sound empowering and liberating. People would see their own happiness, success, and fulfillment as the highest good, placing themselves at the center of their universe. The appeal of self-worship is its simplicity. It promises control, autonomy, and instant gratification. There are no demands for humility or sacrifice, no calls to serve others. It's a faith of convenience, where the self is both the creator and the worshiper. At the core of self-worship is the illusion of ultimate authority. If I were the devil, I'd make people believe that their feelings, instincts, and desires are infallible guides. "Trust yourself above all else," I'd whisper. "You know best." This mindset shifts people's focus inward, disconnecting them from external wisdom, accountability, and higher truths. They become their own moral compass, shaping right and wrong to fit their preferences. Over time, this illusion of authority blinds them to their limitations, leading to decisions driven by pride and selfishness. While self-worship appears to offer empowerment, it often leads to isolation. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that people prioritize their individual needs over their relationships, communities, and spiritual growth. Put yourself first, I'd say. You can't rely on anyone else. This relentless focus on the self creates a barrier to connection. People become less willing to compromise, to serve, or to empathize with others. They lose the joy of shared experiences and the depth of relationships built on humility and mutual care. Instead, they find themselves alone, surrounded by their achievements but starved of genuine connection. Humility is the antidote to self-worship, but if I were the devil, I'd reframe it as weakness. I'd make people see humility as self-deprecation, a lack of confidence, or a sign of inferiority. Why lower yourself when you can lift yourself up? I'd ask. This rejection of humility cuts people off from growth and grace. Without humility, there's no space for learning, repentance, or reliance on God. The ego takes over, and people become prisoners of their own pride. Self-worship also erodes the call to serve. When the self is the center of the universe, acts of service feel like burdens or distractions. If I were the devil, I'd make people see service as optional, a noble gesture but not a necessity. Focus on yourself first, I'd say. You can help others later. But service is where love, empathy, and community thrive. By turning people inward, I'd strip them of the opportunity to experience the transformative power of serving others. They'd miss the joy of giving, the growth that comes from putting others first, and the deeper connection to God that service fosters. The cost of self-worship is profound. It leads to a life of isolation, disconnection, and spiritual emptiness. While it promises fulfillment, it delivers only fleeting satisfaction, leaving people hungry for more but unsure of what they're missing. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that people never question this emptiness. I'd distract them with new goals, new achievements, and new desires, keeping them trapped in a cycle of self-centered striving. The way back from self-worship is through humility. Humility isn't self-deprecation. It's the recognition that we are part of something greater than ourselves. It's the willingness to learn, to grow, and to place others before our own desires. Imagine a life where the self isn't the center, but a part of a greater whole. This perspective fosters connection, purpose, and joy. By embracing humility, people can rediscover the beauty of service, the strength in community, and the peace that comes from surrendering to God. The question isn't whether the self matters. It does. But will the self be a servant or a master? Self-worship isolates and empties, while humility and service connect and fulfill. By rejecting the illusion of self-sufficiency and embracing a life centered on love, grace, and community, people can break free from the trap of self-worship and step into the fullness of their purpose. The devil's strategy thrives on making the self the ultimate goal. But true fulfillment comes from something far greater: a life lived in connection, service, and humility before God. The choice is clear: will we worship ourselves, or will we worship the one who calls us to something higher? How pride and self-centeredness obscure the need for a higher power. If I were the devil, I'd make pride my crowning weapon. Pride is subtle yet powerful. It blinds, isolates, and distorts reality, all while making people feel in control. I'd amplify self-centeredness until the need for a higher power feels irrelevant or even insulting. Why look to something greater when you can handle everything yourself? I'd whisper, and in that whisper, I'd plant the seeds of disconnection, ensuring people never realize how much they truly need God. Pride convinces people they are the authors of their own success. It whispers, "You've done this on your own. You're in control. You don't need help." It feeds on accomplishments, creating a narrative where every victory is the result of personal effort, every success a testament to individual brilliance. If I were the devil, I'd make pride feel like strength. I'd disguise it as confidence, ambition, or independence, ensuring that people see it as a virtue rather than a vice. They wouldn't realize that pride, when unchecked, becomes a barrier, a wall that separates them from humility, relationships, and ultimately God. Self-centeredness builds on pride, turning the focus inward. If I were the devil, I'd make people so preoccupied with their own desires, goals, and struggles that they have no energy left for anything or anyone else. I'd ensure that their world feels small, revolving entirely around their needs and achievements. This inward focus would obscure the bigger picture. People wouldn't see their interconnectedness with others or their place in a greater divine plan. Instead, they'd become consumed with their own stories, leaving no room for the humility needed to seek God. Pride and self-centeredness create the illusion of self-sufficiency. When people believe they're capable of thriving on their own, they no longer see the need for a higher power. "You've got this," I'd whisper. "You don't need anyone else, not even God." This mindset leads to spiritual stagnation. Without acknowledging their dependence on God, people stop seeking His guidance, wisdom, or presence. They become trapped in a cycle of striving and self-reliance, unable to experience the peace that comes from surrendering to something greater. Pride also distorts how people view themselves and others. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that pride makes people feel superior. "You're better than them," I'd say. "You don't need their advice or support." This sense of superiority isolates them from community and blinds them to their own flaws. At the same time, pride creates a fear of vulnerability. Admitting weakness or asking for help feels like failure, so people double down on their independence, even when they're struggling. This refusal to acknowledge their limitations keeps them from turning to God, who offers strength in their weakness. The cost of pride is disconnection. It severs relationships, both with others and with God. It prevents people from experiencing the humility that opens the door to grace. And it leaves them feeling isolated, even as they appear successful or confident on the surface. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that people never see these costs clearly. I'd keep them focused on their achievements and desires, distracting them from the deeper fulfillment that comes from surrendering their pride. The antidote to pride and self-centeredness is humility. Humility isn't about thinking less of oneself. It's about recognizing one's place in a larger story. It's the willingness to acknowledge limitations, seek help, and admit the need for a higher power. Imagine living with a sense of humility that doesn't diminish but empowers, a mindset that allows people to see themselves as part of a greater whole, connected to others and to God. This humility opens the heart to grace, the mind to wisdom, and the soul to transformation. The irony of pride is that it feels like freedom, but it's a trap. True freedom comes not from self-reliance, but from surrender, letting go of the need to control everything and trusting in God's plan. By releasing pride, people can experience a deeper connection to themselves, others, and the divine. The question is this: will we cling to pride and self-centeredness, or will we embrace the humility that leads to true growth and peace? The devil's whisper says, "You're enough on your own." But the truth is that only in acknowledging our need for God can we find the fullness of life we were created for. Chapter 11. The False Path to Enlightenment, Spiritual Experiences that Feel Fulfilling but Lead Nowhere. If I were the devil, I wouldn't discourage people from seeking spiritual experiences. In fact, I'd encourage it. But I'd make sure those experiences are shallow imitations of true enlightenment, paths that feel meaningful but ultimately lead nowhere. My goal wouldn't be to stop their journey. It would be to keep them walking in circles, content with the illusion of progress while never actually growing closer to God. The false path to enlightenment is enticing because it offers the feeling of spirituality without the cost. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that these paths promise fulfillment, joy, and connection while requiring little in the way of commitment, sacrifice, or accountability. People would feel like they're growing spiritually, but they'd never be challenged to examine their hearts, confront their flaws, or seek a higher truth. These experiences would focus on the self, offering a comforting sense of control. Practices like meditation, visualization, or energy work, though not inherently harmful, would become distractions when stripped of their deeper purpose. They'd offer temporary relief without leading to lasting transformation. One of the most effective tools in my arsenal would be the illusion of progress. If I were the devil, I'd design spiritual experiences that feel transformative in the moment but fade quickly, leaving people hungry for more. They'd attend retreats, read books, and participate in rituals that offer fleeting inspiration, always chasing the next experience but never finding the depth they crave. This cycle would keep them busy, ensuring they mistake activity for growth. They'd believe they're on the right path because they're doing so much, but they'd never stop to ask whether they're moving closer to God or simply going through the motions. The most dangerous aspect of the false path is how closely it resembles the truth. If I were the devil, I'd create spiritual experiences that mimic the light of God's presence but lack its power. People would feel peaceful, uplifted, or even euphoric, mistaking these emotions for evidence of divine connection. This counterfeit light would keep them from seeking the real thing. Why pursue a deeper relationship with God when the surface-level experience feels good enough? Over time, they'd grow content with the imitation, never realizing what they're missing. False paths often center on the self, emphasizing personal growth, empowerment, or enlightenment without acknowledging the need for humility or surrender. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that people see spirituality as a solo journey, one they can navigate on their own terms. This self-focused approach blinds people to the reality of their dependence on God. They'd believe they can achieve spiritual fulfillment through their own efforts, never recognizing the emptiness of a path that excludes the divine. Their spirituality would feel personal and meaningful, but it would lack the depth and connection that true faith provides. The false path to enlightenment leads to spiritual stagnation. People feel like they're growing, but their lives remain unchanged. They experience fleeting moments of peace or joy, but these emotions fail to translate into lasting transformation. Over time, the emptiness of the false path becomes apparent, leaving them disillusioned and disconnected. If I were the devil, I'd use this disillusionment to deepen their sense of frustration. "You've tried spirituality, and it didn't work," I'd whisper. "Maybe there's nothing more to find." This hopelessness would become a barrier, preventing them from seeking the truth that could set them free. The way back from the false path begins with discernment. True enlightenment isn't about feeling good, it's about becoming whole. It requires humility, discipline, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. It calls for connection to something greater than oneself, a surrender to the divine that leads to genuine transformation. Imagine a spiritual journey that doesn't just offer fleeting moments of peace, but transforms every aspect of your life. This is the true path to enlightenment, one that goes beyond surface-level experiences to cultivate deeper faith, purpose, and connection. The question is this: are we content with the imitation, or will we seek the real thing? The devil's false paths may feel fulfilling in the moment, but they ultimately lead to emptiness. True enlightenment requires more, but it also offers more. By rejecting the counterfeit light and embracing the challenges of true spiritual growth, we can find a deeper, lasting connection to God. The false path is wide and easy, but the true path is narrow and demanding, and it leads to a life of meaning, joy, and transformation that no imitation can match. How partial truths can be more dangerous than outright lies. If I were the devil, I wouldn't rely solely on outright lies to lead people astray. Lies are often too obvious, too easy to reject. Instead, I'd use partial truths, fragments of reality wrapped in enough deception to mislead without arousing suspicion. These half-truths would appear credible, even virtuous, making them far more dangerous than blatant falsehoods. A partial truth doesn't require someone to abandon what they believe entirely. It only needs to nudge them slightly off course, ensuring they never reach their intended destination. Partial truths are powerful because they feel familiar and comforting. If I were the devil, I'd take concepts people already accept, kindness, love, justice, and twist them just enough to suit my purposes. I wouldn't deny these virtues outright, I'd redefine them. For instance, I'd turn love into mere tolerance, where anything goes and accountability disappears. I'd make justice about revenge instead of restoration. By distorting these values, I'd create confusion. People would feel they're pursuing something good while unknowingly straying from deeper truths. The subtlety of partial truths makes them insidious. They don't feel like lies, so they rarely invite scrutiny. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that partial truths appeal to humanity's desire for simplicity. Complex truths often require thought, nuance, and humility. Partial truths, on the other hand, offer convenient answers that feel good in the moment. God wants you to be happy, I'd say, omitting the deeper truth that true joy often requires sacrifice and growth. These simplified messages are easier to accept than the full truth, which can be challenging or uncomfortable. People would embrace them without questioning their completeness, mistaking them for the whole picture. Faith built on partial truths is fragile. If I were the devil, I'd use these half-truths to create a shallow, fragmented spirituality. People might believe in grace but reject discipline, or emphasize love while neglecting truth. They'd cling to the parts of faith that align with their preferences, ignoring the aspects that challenge or stretch them. This fragmented faith would leave them unprepared for life's complexities. When hardship strikes or deeper questions arise, their partial truths would crumble, leaving them feeling betrayed and disillusioned. They wouldn't realize that the problem wasn't faith itself, but the incomplete version they'd embraced. The greatest danger of partial truths is their ability to shield deception. If I were the devil, I'd hide my lies within these fragments of truth, making them harder to detect. For instance, I'd promote the idea that humans are inherently good, a partial truth that ignores the reality of brokenness and the need for redemption. By focusing on what feels right and ignoring what's missing, people would accept the lie without ever realizing it. They'd become so comfortable with the partial truth that they'd stop seeking the full picture. Partial truths lead to partial lives. People who base their decisions and beliefs on incomplete truths often find themselves stuck, unable to grow or flourish. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that these half-truths create a cycle of frustration. They'd feel as though they're doing everything right, but still sense that something is missing. This dissatisfaction would keep them from seeking deeper understanding, leaving them spiritually stagnant. The antidote to partial truths is discernment, the willingness to question, reflect, and seek the full picture. True understanding requires humility, the ability to admit that what we know might be incomplete. It also requires a connection to God, who reveals the fullness of truth through his guidance and wisdom. Imagine approaching life with a hunger for the whole truth, unwilling to settle for fragments. This mindset transforms how we see the world, encouraging us to dig deeper, listen more carefully, and embrace the complexities of faith, relationships, and purpose. The question isn't whether partial truths exist. They do. The question is whether we'll accept them as enough or seek the fullness of truth that brings clarity, purpose, and transformation. The devil thrives on half-truths because they seem harmless. But God calls us to the whole truth, even when it challenges us. By rejecting the seductive simplicity of partial truths and embracing the depth of God's wisdom, we can move beyond the surface and into a life grounded in clarity, authenticity, and grace. Lies may mislead, but partial truths can hold us in place, preventing us from finding the path to real enlightenment. The choice is ours. Will we settle for fragments, or will we seek the whole? Chapter 12. The Disguised Good, Promoting Actions That Appear Virtuous but Serve Selfish Ends. If I were the devil, I'd blur the line between true virtue and self-serving actions. I wouldn't discourage good deeds outright. That would be too obvious. Instead, I'd disguise selfishness as virtue, ensuring that people's actions appear noble while quietly feeding their egos or advancing their own interests. The brilliance of this strategy lies in its subtlety. People would feel righteous, even as their motivations drift further from humility and true service. Good actions aren't inherently good. Their value depends on the intention behind them. If I were the devil, I'd focus on twisting those intentions. Charity would become a way to boost status. Acts of kindness would become transactional, performed with the expectation of something in return. Service would be reduced to a performance, where appearances matter more than impact. These disguised goods would look virtuous on the surface, but beneath them, selfish motives would thrive. People would feel proud of their actions, oblivious to how far they've strayed from genuine humility and love. One of the easiest ways to disguise selfishness as virtue is through the desire for recognition. If I were the devil, I'd make people crave applause for their good deeds. I'd ensure that social media becomes a stage where every act of kindness is carefully documented and shared, not to inspire others, but to earn likes and validation. This focus on recognition turns service into a performance. People would give not because they care, but because they want to be seen as caring. Over time, the pursuit of approval would overshadow the original purpose of their actions, leaving their hearts untouched by the good they do. Transactional goodness, helping others with the expectation of receiving something in return, is another powerful tool. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that people approach relationships, charity, and even faith with a mindset of what's in it for me. They might not say it aloud, but their actions would reveal their expectations. This mindset reduces virtue to a form of bargaining. People would give only when they're certain of a return, turning acts of service into investments rather than expressions of love. While they'd feel justified in their actions, they'd miss the transformative power of selfless generosity. If I were the devil, I'd also frame good deeds as a way to gain influence or authority. People would volunteer, donate, or advocate for causes not out of genuine concern, but to enhance their reputation or advance their careers. Their actions might still benefit others, but the self-serving motives behind them would erode their spiritual impact. This pursuit of power disguised as virtue would be especially dangerous in leadership. Leaders who serve for the sake of control, prestige, or recognition undermine the trust and authenticity that true leadership requires. They might inspire admiration, but they wouldn't inspire transformation. Over time, disguised good erodes people's ability to recognize true virtue. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that they begin to equate appearances with authenticity, mistaking external actions for internal growth. They'd focus so much on what they're doing that they'd neglect who they're becoming. This erosion leaves them spiritually stagnant, unable to experience the depth and joy that come from selfless service. They'd feel like they're doing enough, never realizing how much more fulfilling true virtue could be. The antidote to disguised good is a return to authenticity. True virtue isn't about what others see. It's about the intention behind the action. It requires humility, the willingness to serve without recognition, and the courage to act out of love rather than self-interest. Imagine a world where good deeds are performed quietly, without fanfare, driven solely by the desire to help others. This kind of service transforms both the giver and the receiver, creating a ripple effect of love, compassion, and connection. The question isn't whether our actions appear virtuous, it's whether they truly are. The devil's strategy thrives on disguising selfishness as goodness, keeping people focused on appearances rather than authenticity. But God calls us to a higher standard, one that prioritizes the heart over the image. By examining our intentions and striving for selfless love, we can reject the trap of disguised good and embrace the transformative power of true virtue. The choice is ours. Will we seek to serve, or will we serve to seek? The former leads to fulfillment. The latter leaves us empty, no matter how noble our actions may seem. True goodness begins where selfishness ends. The danger of focusing on appearances over genuine faith. If I were the devil, I'd make people care more about how their faith looks than how it feels. I wouldn't discourage them from going to church, praying, or performing good deeds. In fact, I'd encourage it. But I'd ensure that their actions are motivated by appearances rather than authenticity. Their faith would become a performance, polished on the outside but hollow within. This subtle shift would keep them from ever experiencing the depth and transformation of genuine faith. Focusing on appearances reduces faith to a set of outward actions. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that people prioritize the visible markers of faith, attending services, quoting scripture, or volunteering, while neglecting the internal work of humility, love, and spiritual growth. They'd appear devout, but their connection to God would remain superficial. This performance-driven faith would create a false sense of security. People would feel they're doing enough because they look the part, never realizing that genuine faith is about transformation, not presentation. Their spiritual lives would become like a beautifully wrapped gift box, empty when opened. One of the greatest dangers of focusing on appearances is the need for approval. If I were the devil, I'd make people crave the admiration of others for their faith. They'd perform acts of devotion not to honor God, but to earn validation from their peers. Let them see how faithful you are, I'd whisper. Their approval is what matters. Over time, this pursuit of validation would overshadow their relationship with God. They'd start to measure their spiritual worth by how others perceive them, creating a faith that's more about pleasing people than seeking truth. When faith becomes about appearances, hypocrisy is inevitable. People say the right words, perform the right rituals, and maintain the right image, but their hearts remain unchanged. If I were the devil, I'd amplify this dissonance, ensuring they never confront the gap between their public persona and their private reality. This kind of faith often leads to judgmental attitudes. Those who focus on appearances feel compelled to compare themselves to others, elevating their own righteousness while condemning others for falling short. They forget that true faith isn't about competition, but about grace and humility. Another danger of focusing on appearances is the reliance on external metrics. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that people measure their faith by how much they give, how often they pray, or how many Bible verses they know. While these actions aren't wrong, they're incomplete. True faith isn't about checking boxes, it's about a living, growing relationship with God. This focus on external metrics keeps people from examining their inner lives. They'd avoid questions like, am I growing in love, patience, and kindness? Or am I truly trusting God? Instead, they'd rely on visible actions to affirm their faith, never addressing the deeper work of transformation. Focusing on appearances leads to spiritual emptiness. People may look successful in their faith, but they feel unfulfilled because their connection to God is shallow. If I were the devil, I'd ensure they never question this emptiness. You're doing everything right, I'd whisper. Why would you need to change? But appearances can't sustain the soul. When challenges arise, this surface-level faith often crumbles, leaving people disillusioned and disconnected. They realize too late that their image of faith was just that, an image, not a reality. The antidote to a faith focused on appearances is authenticity. True faith isn't about how it looks to others. It's about how it feels within. It requires humility, vulnerability, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. It's less about public displays and more about private moments of trust, surrender, and connection with God. Imagine a faith that's not about impressing others, but about growing closer to God. This kind of faith transforms lives, radiating outward in love, grace, and humility. It's not about being seen as faithful, it's about being faithful. The question isn't whether we're practicing faith, it's whether we're living it. The devil's strategy thrives on keeping people focused on appearances, distracting them from the inner transformation that faith requires. But God calls us to something deeper, something real. By shifting our focus from how our faith looks to how it feels, we can move beyond the trap of appearances and embrace the fullness of a genuine relationship with God. True faith isn't about how others see us. It's about how we see ourselves in the light of His love and grace. Will we settle for the shallow comfort of appearances, or will we dive into the depths of authentic faith? The choice is ours. Conclusion: breaking the chains. If I were the devil, my greatest success would be keeping people unaware of my tactics. Subtlety is my greatest weapon. The chains I forge are rarely obvious. But once these chains are recognized for what they begin to weaken. The power lies not in the chains themselves, but in the illusion that they are unbreakable. The first step to freedom is seeing them clearly, and the next is taking intentional steps to break them. This journey of recognizing, resisting, and reclaiming requires vigilance, courage, and a commitment to truth. The devil's strategies aren't always grand gestures of destruction. They're small nudges, whispers, and distortions that pull us away from God one subtle step at a time. Distraction, division, false fulfillment, and pride are just a few of the many tools used to obscure the truth and keep us spiritually stagnant. Recognizing these tactics requires awareness. Ask yourself, where in my life have I settled for good enough over genuine growth? Are my actions motivated by love or by a need for recognition and approval? Am I pursuing truth, or have I accepted comforting partial truths instead? Recognizing these patterns isn't about guilt, it's about clarity. Once we see the chains, we can begin the work of breaking them. Breaking free from the devil's tactics means actively resisting the forces that pull us away from God. This resistance doesn't happen passively. It requires intention and effort. Guard your mind. The devil thrives on confusion and distraction. Commit to regular reflection, prayer, and study to center yourself in truth. Seek accountability. Isolation is fertile ground for deception. Surround yourself with people who challenge and encourage you, keeping your faith grounded. Reject fear and pride. Fear isolates and pride blinds. Choose humility and trust, opening yourself to the transformative power of grace. Resistance isn't a one-time act. It's a daily commitment to align your life with God's truth rather than the devil's distortions. Breaking the chains isn't just about resistance. It's about reclaiming the life God intended for you. True freedom is found in connection, humility, and service. It's not about perfection but about progress, a willingness to grow, to love, and to seek truth even when it's uncomfortable. To reclaim your freedom, recenter on God. Let Him be your anchor, your guide, and your source of strength. Freedom comes not from self-reliance, but from surrender to His will. Live authentically. Let your faith be genuine, not performative. Pursue a relationship with God that transforms you from the inside out. Serve selflessly. True freedom isn't about focusing on yourself. It's about giving freely and loving deeply, reflecting the heart of God in your actions. Awareness is the devil's greatest enemy. Once you recognize the subtle traps and illusions, their power begins to fade. The chains lose their hold when exposed to the light of truth. By staying vigilant, grounded, and connected to God, you can break free and live a life that reflects His love and grace. The devil's greatest victory isn't in destroying faith outright. It's in keeping us unaware, distracted, and complacent. The question isn't whether we've encountered his tactics. We all have. The question is whether we'll allow them to keep us bound or take the steps to break free. The choice is yours. Will you live in the chains of deception, or will you step into the freedom of truth? The path to breaking free isn't easy, but it's worth every step. And once you begin, you'll find that the chains were never as strong as they seemed. Live free, seek truth, and never stop growing. This is how we break the chains. Reconnecting with God through humility, reflection, and intentional living. If I were the devil, my ultimate goal would be to create as much distance as possible between people and God. But what I'd never admit is that the path back to Him is always open. No matter how far someone may feel from God, the reconnection is only a step away. Through humility, reflection, and intentional living, the barriers begin to crumble and the relationship with God is restored, not through grand gestures but through quiet, consistent effort. Humility is the foundation of reconnecting with God. It's the recognition that we are not the center of the universe, that we are fallible and in need of grace. If I were the devil, I'd make people see humility as weakness, something to avoid at all costs. But true humility isn't about diminishing yourself. It's about seeing yourself clearly, acknowledging your limitations, and opening yourself to God's strength. To embrace humility. Admit when you've fallen short and seek forgiveness. Let go of pride and the need to control everything. Approach God not with demands, but with trust and surrender. Humility clears the path for grace to flow freely, breaking down the walls of isolation and self-reliance. Reflection is the mirror through which we see our spiritual condition. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that people are too busy or distracted to reflect. I'd make them avoid the uncomfortable questions that lead to growth. But reflection is where transformation begins. Through reflection, we ask, where have I prioritized myself over God? What distractions or illusions have pulled me away from Him? How can I realign my actions and intentions with His truth? Reflection isn't about dwelling on failures, but about learning from them. It's a process of rediscovering what matters most and making the conscious decision to return to God. Reconnection requires more than recognition. It demands intentional living. If I were the devil, I'd make people believe that faith is a passive experience, something that happens in the background. But intentional living places God at the center of every decision, action, and thought. To live intentionally, prioritize time with God. Daily prayer, reading, and quiet moments create space for connection. Serve others. True faith manifests in love and service, reflecting God's heart in the way you treat others. Align your goals. Pursue dreams and ambitions that honor God's purpose for your life, rather than solely your own desires. Intentional living transforms faith from a ritual into a relationship, one that grows deeper with every step. Reconnecting with God isn't about perfection, it's about presence. It's not about never stumbling, but about knowing who to turn to when you do. The joy of reconnection is found in the peace, purpose, and love that flow from a restored relationship with God. Imagine a life where you're no longer striving alone, no longer distracted by illusions or chained by pride. A life where your actions align with your values, your heart aligns with God's, and your days are filled with meaning and connection. This is the gift of humility, reflection, and intentional living. No matter how far we've wandered, God's invitation remains the same. Come back to me. Reconnection doesn't require extraordinary acts or perfect faith. It begins with a simple step. Through humility, we acknowledge our need. Through reflection, we see where we've gone astray. And through intentional living, we take the path back to Him. The question isn't whether God is waiting for you. He is. The question is, will you take that first step? By embracing humility, reflection, and intentionality, you can break through the barriers and rediscover the profound joy of walking with God. The journey back isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. A call to awareness. Choosing the path of truth and light in a world full of distractions. If I were the devil, I'd fill the world with distractions. Not just the obvious ones, but those that seem harmless or even good. I'd keep people busy, entertained, and preoccupied, ensuring they rarely pause to question their direction. My ultimate goal would be to make them forget the path of truth and light altogether. But awareness is the antidote, the first step toward breaking free. Awareness brings clarity, choice, and the power to turn toward what truly matters. Awareness is about seeing the world, and yourself clearly. It's recognizing the subtle ways distractions pull you away from your purpose, your relationships, and your connection with God. If I were the devil, I'd make people feel comfortable in their routines, too numb to notice how far they've drifted from truth. Awareness requires asking hard questions. What consumes my attention and energy? Are my actions aligned with my values, or have I been led astray by convenience and comfort? Am I pursuing truth, or settling for partial versions of it that feel easier to handle? This kind of self-examination is difficult, but it's also liberating. It shines a light on the chains of distraction and illusion, making it possible to choose something better. The path of truth is not always the easiest, but it's the one that leads to lasting peace and fulfillment. If I were the devil, I'd ensure that the truth feels burdensome or unattainable, making the easier, shallower paths more appealing. But the truth, though challenging, is always worth pursuing. Choosing the path of truth means seeking depth. Refuse to settle for surface-level understanding. Dig deeper into your beliefs, relationships, and purpose. Prioritizing integrity. Align your actions with your values, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. Listening to God's voice. Amid the noise of the world, create space to hear the still, small voice of truth and guidance. Truth isn't just about knowing what's right. It's about living in alignment with it, allowing it to transform every aspect of your life. The path of light is the path of connection, humility, and service. If I were the devil, I'd make the light seem distant or unattainable, convincing people that darkness is their only option. But the light is always near, always accessible to those who seek it. Walking in the light means embracing gratitude, recognize the blessings in your life, and let them remind you of God's presence. Serving others, let your actions reflect the light within you, bringing hope and love to those around you. Living with purpose, focus your energy on what truly matters, rather than being consumed by distractions. The light isn't a destination, it's a way of being. It's the courage to live authentically, the strength to face challenges with faith, and the grace to love unconditionally. In a world full of distractions, the choice to follow the path of truth and light is a radical one. If I were the devil, I'd make that choice seem impossible. I'd fill your days with noise, urgency, and endless to-do lists, leaving no room for reflection or connection. But God's call is quiet yet persistent. It's the tug in your heart that says, there's more to life than this. It's the invitation to step away from the chaos and into the stillness where truth and light reside. The choice is yours. Will you continue down the path of distraction, or will you choose the path of truth and light? Awareness is the first step, but action must follow. It's not enough to see the chains, you must break them. It's not enough to recognize the distractions, you must reject them. Imagine a life where your days are guided not by the demands of the world, but by the truth and light of God's presence. A life where you're no longer pulled in 1,000 directions, but anchored in purpose, peace, and connection. This is the life God calls you to, if only you'll choose it. The path of truth and light is open to all. It requires courage, commitment, and a willingness to let go of what holds you back. But the rewards are immeasurable, a life of meaning, joy, and an unshakable connection to the one who created you. Will you answer the call? The choice is yours, and it begins now. A personal note to you, our readers. Thank you for taking this journey with us through If I Was the Devil. We hope these pages have not only opened your eyes to the subtle forces at play in our lives, but also inspired you to seek truth, embrace humility, and walk in the light with renewed purpose. This book was crafted to spark reflection, deepen connection, and encourage transformation, and we couldn't do it without your support. Join us in spreading the light. Our mission doesn't stop here. Through our channel, we're committed to sharing thought-provoking insights, engaging discussions, and transformative content that helps people grow spiritually, emotionally, and intellectually. If you found value in this book, imagine what we can achieve together as a community. Here's how you can help us keep creating. Subscribe to our channel. Be part of our growing community by subscribing to Mindful Literary. Don't miss out on future content designed to inspire and uplift. Engage with us, like, comment, and share our videos. Your interaction helps us reach more people who need these messages. Support our work. Consider becoming a member or contributing to our mission through our Ko-Fi page at www.ko-fi.com/mindfulliterary. Your support allows us to continue creating high-quality, meaningful content. Together, we make a difference. Your support not only sustains us, but also helps amplify the message of light and truth in a world full of distractions. By joining us, you're not just a viewer or reader. You're an essential part of a movement to inspire deeper thinking and intentional living. Let's continue this journey together. Subscribe, share, and let others know that there's a place for those who seek wisdom, connection, and growth. Together, we can bring more light into the world. One book, one video, one conversation at a time. Thank you for being here, for supporting us, and for choosing to walk this path with us. The journey continues, and we're honored to have you with us every step of the way. Subscribe now, and let's keep growing together.